Hello everyone, a question and answer video today. Two comments actually from the Roman Levantine Archer Auxilia video that I re-uploaded recently, made a couple of years ago actually. Being, you mentioned that slingers fell out of use with the Romans. Was this because archers replaced them in the general role of missile troops? And then keep busting those myths. I like it when you exclaim that a certain notion, such as the ancients' rapid firing arrows, is bullshit. Alright, because those are my excesses during the video. Alright, so these are the first. I mean, the main question is the first one, and it's actually a very difficult and big question at the same time, because for most things, ancient and relatively to the relation between archery and slings, etc., we don't really know. This is I'm usually against the idea that the answer should be we don't know, because that effectively means that I don't know. But we don't know in general, right? We have a general idea that fundamentally revolves around the fact that archery somewhat developed over time, and that these improvements at some point outclassed the sling by some degree. This is at least, if you search the average answer on the internet, on Quoras, etc., people always talk about the technology of it, and that's again the the cheap answer, if you want, because these things have quite rarely to do with technology per se, right? And at least that was always a thing, but it was first of all a political social consequence rather than a technological factor that changed the way these weapons were used, in quantitatively speaking, etc. Because first of all, we're talking about weapons that always remain there. In that video, I don't remember exactly what I said, because again, it was like a couple of years ago. But if I remember correctly, I was referring to the fact that is, in fact, the thing with the Roman military. Here was talking about the Levantine Auxilia, so something mostly early imperial, is the fact that from classical antiquity to late antiquity, we see much. So a period that eventually was dominated by Rome largely, and this is important to stress in the general background of the pool of information that we have, because this can mean lots of things. That we see less slings around, like probably the mention and the representation of slingers decreases sharply, and this could be motivated by various factors that may even in part be unhinged probably from the actual degree of employment of these weapons. So especially when we look at at famous slingers from Rhodes or the Balearic Islands, have become a bit popularized, but there were many slingers in many areas of Greece, even among the Celts, etc. Basically everybody used slings, and that's kind of obvious because it's a very cheap weapon that you can use basically in any context, albeit it does have some limitations in the employment itself. For example, in closed spaces you can't quite use it, and in general these communities, especially Rhodes, Balearic Islands. Why? But I think in that video I actually talk about that too. Well, because these were areas inhabited mostly by shepherds that practiced a lot with the slings, and they were concentrated there simply, and they sold their service as, in fact, mercenary slingers around the Mediterranean for us to kind of, read their names mentioned a couple of times in the ancient historiography and say, okay, well, these guys were kind of about that most. Of course, there would be lots, I don't know, of Balearics or Rhodians who fought in other ways, right? But the idea is that the sling, in fact, and this is what makes them somewhat interesting as slingers, stereotypically, because the sling, after all, was used a bit by everybody, right? We can assume that, I don't know, the typical Italic farmer that made up the legionary infantry in the same period was actually skilled in the use of slings as well as simple bow, etc. Like most people living in the countryside and having to hunt a little bit, like this, naturally military, and that's what get in part to with the second comment is, military employment of these weapons is somewhat different from the the civilian one. I give you that at the time such a difference was pretty blurred, and of course slingers and archers were actually some of the cheapest and more common light infantry wise type of troopers that you could find in the ancient world, and also for this reason they weren't quite actually valuable per se. So what probably we see again with the that concentration, like the references about mercenary slingers coming from certain places in Mediterranean and in Europe, as somewhat specialists in that role that would sell their service in the Hellenistic, in the Roman militaries and so on, are probably an exception, entrepreneurially wise. That is to say, probably the fact that they used the sling was just random. These were rough people, of course, living in rough situation that were just hungry, right? So that's why they would go making a business such as the military one, that is not just what the average, I don't know, Hellenic or Roman middle class individual would like to engage in, because it was just risky, etc. So that factor used to be considered. Given also that, Rhodians, Balearics were at the center of pretty stormy contexts, internationally speaking, right? The peoples around were pretty rich, and they made a lot of war, and so it was kind of obvious that in this kind of more isolated realities, maybe these people had habituated just to use the sling on a regular basis, would work as better slingers than others. Now, the point that I made in the video, I think I'm sure of that, even if I don't remember actually what I said, is the general one historiography has made, that is equating the decrease in references to slingers from early to late Roman times to kind of militarization, disarmament, and gentrification of the, in fact, European and Mediterranean people on the, let's say, the gradual expansion of Roman domination. This happened easily, right? The Romans took over as a major power that naturally wanted to keep things under control, didn't like revolts, didn't like brigandage and things like that. So stripping the inhabitants of most offensive capabilities was an important thing. And I give you that in this sense, it's not that you could deprive a countryside of things like slings or bows that were normally used for hunting. But as we were saying before, like, it's not that there were armies that were winning with slings or bows, right? These were always kind of light infantry that essentially backed the heavy infantry battle lines, supported by cavalry, and those were the main units of the army. So even though absolutely slings and even bows, etc., could deliver devastating blows, and there is a lot of technological attention towards that, when we look at a battlefield, you realize that they were rarely any kind of relevant. And in fact, in the battle descriptions, you don't really find much of a reference of them, if not properly in the skirmishing phases, etc., that were kind of normally waged by all peoples. Also, there is another factor that is to be considered, that very often we again, because we're technologistically obsessed, we think that just because weapons like slings or bows are long-range missile throwing, this long range actually has any specific, say, a sort of absolute value that, I don't know, with a javelin you can't reach. Actually, war say the combat spreads everywhere, right, in ways that doesn't make much difference to say, okay, it's better to have just slingers or bowmen as opposed to javeliners or something, because in terms of volume of fire, what you can actually achieve even at close range, think about the Roman pila, for example, that conferred the Romans a superiority in firepower that no other army at the time had. And in fact, the Romans, interestingly enough, they're not particularly famous for slingers or archers, especially in Republican times when they kind of fought more with the traditional Italic kind of type of warfare, even though they surely had them, right? But they wouldn't need them in absolute terms, right? And so what you see in practice is that, diversifying the arsenal in a way. And in this video, in fact, I was talking about the alleged Levantine archer auxilia that it's not in quote unquote, Levantine is not quote unquote much because of a terminological matter, but probably because we have often said, especially from the Trajanic column, etc., that those guys are Syrians, right? Because we have, now the thing is complicated. I was explaining it, in fact, in that video, so if you want to, you can check that out for an explanation. But there were actually they could have easily been Balkanic troops, right? Or even from Central Europe, right? It depends, because the typology of helmet was widespread all over an area. It was enormous. It was all the Pontic one, the Middle Eastern one, the Balkan one, etc. And we know too few, actually, to be categorical about the fact that there were Levantine, Syrian more than else, right? So this obsession for categorization that doesn't even match with the actual data is just product of the Enlightenment encyclopedistic need to establish everything once for all, where history is everything but that, frankly. And so the idea of the disarmament and the general pacification and gentrification of the communities that provided with these specialists is a sensible idea, because, as you know, the Romans gradually civilized these entire populations at the point they didn't have. First of all, they all kind of became Roman citizens by the early 3rd century, and the Romans started to have problems properly finding recruits within their own within the empire, so they would had to hire mercenaries from the Barbaricum, and these people were quite warlike, and say each of them had their own national specialty in a way. The late empire, now that I think, is also the moment in the spread of the composite bow in the Roman army on a large scale, also in the West, that traditionally would remain with a simple bow, actually, that went on throughout all history, since prehistory, as a matter of fact, even during the Middle Ages. And that the composite bow, as you know, increases a lot of power. So kind of the idea that archery not only spread because the Romans, generally speaking, got this greater archery bias, being in contact with peoples like the Persians, the Sarmatians, etc., and they kept using, even in fact auxiliaries in this case, that used these weapons in the West, where generally speaking archery and slings were used and were actually probably more common than we think in war, but they weren't quite like the steppe tradition that had brought to the development. The composite bow and that kind of fitness and use, I don't know, that Iranian horseman was normally doing, but just think about aiming capacities in terms of, even though those again were not, as we'll see later, not particularly necessary in war, but if not in other contexts, let's say better, but let's say it was a completely different approach to the bow itself, right? Western and Eastern cultures differ importantly on this level, and there are other factors involved, such as, for example, the greater use of cavalry in the East, and so mounted archery and all this stuff that in the West wasn't quite a thing, at least not proportionally, even because it's overlooked actually in the fact that it did exist also in the West, but it's not often noticed. So again, the demilitarization of the West plus more, advanced archery stuff from the East is a good reason for explaining why probably slingers were somewhat declining in importance. So that during the late antiquity, not just in Europe and the Mediterranean, but also in the Middle East, there is a decline of the middle classes, a certain increase of feudalization, also the rise of mounted elites, the reinjection from the steppes of this kind of knightly model, literally, that at that point it weakens the middle classes, weakens those who could, let's say, that had taken part almost democratically to war back in the day, because they didn't have the means, they didn't have the motivation, they didn't have the perspectives, right? Their governments also were increasingly tightening the control on them, etc. And especially the militaries were becoming ever more properly engineered, even from a doctrinal point of view, properly the tactical employment, etc. What I mean is that if you had there is a technologistic explanation which would go as far as the bow is easier to use, right? Which is a big statement, because indeed the sling requires a lot of training and probably a lifestyle connected to it. Archery also takes a lot of training, but probably is quicker, in fact. And also there are some, types of of employment properly of the archer, that even in terms of spaces on the battlefield, there's some, and also the range that that conferred some advantage in that regard. But especially in that sense, only a professional military can provide you with what we're talking about in the latter comment on this properly disciplined and regular and orderly use of the volleys properly. That is to say, the ancient rapid-firing arrows that you see, in that video I was referring to a video that was quite famous on Facebook some years ago. In some historical martial arts school, they were showing how, quickly an archer could fire, right? Rapid fired, short range, by the way, against some targets. And even the actual authors of that video said, well, this was probably it was possible they would do it, but it's not that you have to contextualize in which situation you would want to use that. And lots of people, of course, without any kind of sensible ideas, let's put it in this way, began to share that thing like animals, so much that the video went viral by saying, look, and have this hidden knowledge of the ancients that knew how to shoot like in this quick way, that were like superheroes that would always hit, and not thinking that those things were actually, yes, done, but it would have been better done in a circus already at the time than on a battlefield, which is a real thing. On a battlefield, what you really want to maximize the effect against the enemy are actually, right, having this cadenced, rhythmed, accurate mass volleys that you can throw all at once, right? They have basically nothing to do with precision fire, rather with accuracy and just throwing this volley all together on a concentrated mass of enemies, and therefore maximizing the disruption in as long as you concentrate the volley right at a given time, which can be exploited by, somebody was eventually going to attack that formation, because if you shot the same amount of arrows, let's say in the time equally, let's say in the time between a volley and another, you would actually disorder the enemy formation less, even if all the hits where the same hits were scored, right? Instead, if you throw all those arrows at once, you can, at that moment, but also in general, maximize, kind of create a greater psychophysical shock to the formation, so that they will fear more at that point because they have been punched in that fashion, and that is what actually causes, at parity of shots, the actual effect on the battlefield. So that rapid arrow fire is of course bullshit in a military context, because it basically has no use whatsoever unless you are kind of, I don't know, maybe you're just a scout out there in some forest, there is a guy that emerges wants to kill you. Maybe that in that context, if you're very, very good enough, which really depends on, I don't know, whether it's day or night, if you have eaten or not, if you're just, thinking about something or not, you can't be surprised or not, you don't know. You may be able to score that hit if you're really very quick at doing that, but still also with much less degree of penetrative power, because it's quick and you can't fully extend even if you can tend the bow and all these things. And so in practice, it's virtually insignificant by any military degree. And as such, it shouldn't be properly considered, right? The fact that I made videos, for example, on 6th century Byzantine archery training, which also habituated the recruits to fire in such precision fashion in some context, which of course would come to happen, right? Being precise to literally hit in the right spot, etc. It's something that can happen in many, if not the average condition, in combat, right? Because not everything is a pitched battle, and if you're just maybe a unit of 60 men facing, I don't know, 30 enemy cavalry, you may want to know how to hit them with some degree of precision in that context. An engagement can last for some minute, but it's not about the rapidity of fire there. It's mostly about the precision, knowing how to hit the target in movement, things that again are very difficult to do, especially in such heated moments like in combat, when you're risking your life, you're adrenaline loaded, you're very high, and you definitely have much less concentration available, let's say, even for performing such stunts with bows. And precision may have to do with the reason why the bow surpassed the sling in these times as well, because it's as if, again, the military became kind of more organized. It was easier to have archers than slingers properly in training, even if bows and arrows do cost more, etc. But in this sense, they could have been more precise, more concentrated. They may have exploited also this, because we think just of infantry archers, but again, this may have been just dismounted horse archers. In fact, this is actually what we see later on, that in part tells us that slings were still used, because they would always be used. Like slings, we'll talk about it later, because as you know, as a medievalist, I've checked a little bit the battlefields at the time. But the idea is, when you look at late Roman military Byzantine manuals later on, etc., up to even the 12th to 13th century, and beyond even, there is always the indication, the prescription of knowing how to use slings in the Roman army, both for heavy and light infantry. And again, this is one of those aspects we tend to overlook, again, how many secondary weapons were actually used in many contexts, right? Or especially how common it would be for a soldier in the first place, or a warrior, to know how to use every kind of weapon in a way or another, right? The same Roman legionnaire that, of course, was relatively standardized in equipment, especially in early time, as a sole type of kind of heavy infantryman, actually knew, as we were saying before, to use basically every weapon could be found in the battlefield, and they trained for that. And also the same mounted combat thing was probably more common than we think as an expertise, or as a type of ability in the first place for even for a Roman legionnaire. So this is a question. The sling would remain in use on the battlefields. The problem is that, as we were saying before, towards late antique times and early medieval times, warfare got aristocratic, more aristocratic in nature, at least. By the High Middle Ages, effectively, the battlefields were precluded to the peasantry, largely. And given that the sling is mostly a peasantry weapon, that may be a thing. I studied in some deep detail the late 13th and the early 14th century Western European warfare, and I've found very rare, but very rare mentions of slings, compared to, at that point, mostly was a crossbow that had surpassed easily, in practice, even the need of having archery of some time. Or even in that sense, when you find archery in late medieval times, it's mostly by some, you could argue in late Roman times, a very specific kind of doctrinally engineered type of fighter. Like, the English longbowmen were specifically cultivated by order of the English monarchy, because longbowmen or archers were present everywhere in Europe, right? That was the only country when the thing was incentivized on purpose to have a very specific type of armor, which is quite rare, right? There was no the longbow was nor a English or British specialty. It was present everywhere, and in our places didn't develop as much. That was also a professional model. Also in there, actually, when we look at Welsh longbowmen, and people still think that the Welsh had anything kind of, we were special at archery. They weren't, actually. The English archers were even paid more historically. That's just because of Geraldus Cambrensis that tells the story, but for that reason, we have no evidence that the Welsh either were better than the English at archery, nor that they spread archery in the English armies. It's a thing that people still believe. I don't know for which reason, but historiography has debunked it abundantly. But that's still a simple thing, because the Welsh might have been kind of the Rhodians or the Balearics of Britain. In medieval times, they were poor. And that's the reason why you find so many of them in the English armies. Not because they were necessarily better at something that literally more or less everybody could do, especially if you paid them for training further, especially as it happened in the English kingdom by issue, etc. Same can be said, I don't know, for the armies of Charles the Bold. That the Burgundians also had many English archers that went there as veterans also fighting. But the rest of Europe actually doesn't give a damn about longbows, right? Keeps using crossbows, and this, in spite of all the mythology that has been created about the 100 Years' War tactics, it was not really a problem, right? The English won their wars, their battles during the 100 Years' War, not because they had the longbow as a technology. That has literally nothing, but I mean nothing, to do with that. First of all, the English used an enormous amount of archers. Also, just quantitatively speaking, if you look at, for example, the comparison with the confrontation with the crossbowmen from the French side, there is no match. There were simply much more, and that factor is normally not even taken into account, which should be one of the basic ones taken by the military analysis. But again, there is the modernistic, technologistic, progressistic mythology that we have decided to introduce since the 18th century. So everything is like that. It's a pretty silly idea, and in general, by the High Middle Ages, the missile troops become fundamentally crossbowmen, right? And they actually even absorb historically what had been normally the task of javeliners. That was something you could find up to that point by some degree, and that acted, even tactically speaking, pretty much in similar fashion. So the sling, however, was probably more used than we think in general, both in late antique and early medieval times, properly as a war weapon. And it's just the type of representation that probably doesn't, I mean, the scarcity of sources in the first place, that generally speaking were not even so eager politically, and given the aristocratic ethos behind that, to show guys like with that kind of weapon. The same goes in part for bows, right? Bows were, we know it from the low recruitment laws of the Romano-Germanic kingdoms, even up to late in the High Middle Ages, that the standard requirement, if you were the poorest person of all, was bow and quiver, right? And there were lots of them, presumably, because of that reason. Because literally all the scum of society, basically, first of all, knew how to use them and could provide them, and as a consequence, given that they were many, but still the world that their communities at the time were ruled by heavy cavalry and by the nobility, shows that after all, it's not even about the type of weapon that matters, but about the moral, as always in Clausewitzian terms, the moral force of those who use them. And in general, of course, there is also a mechanic thing, that is to say, no army could stop cavalry just with missile weapons. This never happened historically in every single context. Not even the 100 Years' War, because there were the freaking men-at-arms in the middle, right? The longbow and alone didn't make it alone, because it was a combined armed tactics, and the two things existed just in function of each other. And so again, given that the battlefield is getting overwhelmingly dominated by cavalry at some point, properly moral force, even though the cavalry was just an elite, that tells you what the deal was. That generally speaking, these missile troops, either for the fact that they didn't properly have a reason to oppose an elite that would blast them in the first place, and on the battlefield and at home, they. And the fact that they would just be people leaving for survival, right? You're talking about survival rate economies, where these people didn't really have much time to spend by training with weapons, right? So, and especially nobody would pay them for it. And secondly, they also would be useless individually with that capacity alone. And the important was to have the power of having horses and armor and swords, and people knew how to fight with that system combined, which was the feudal elite, which basically it's what the entire world, that those entire peasants worked to maintain entirely. And plus other type of people that literally lived as professionals, which is what made the difference, professionals of war, even in the masnata of the señores, etc. And thus, what's even missile trooper against a heavy infantryman, right? The latter on the battlefield of how it implodes, it's more important, it's heavier, it's more relevant, right? So the idea is quite importantly connected with the political and social background. So again, we have the impression that in early Rome, let's say in classical times, to put it in this way, slings, especially in Mediterranean, were still composite bows, etc., were not around, were quite important in some, especially when the market of war was florid and there were lots of poor, hungry people who knew how to use the sling and could sell their service in that regard. But then these people became disarmed, pacified, gentrified, and wouldn't even have much inclination to fight anymore, wouldn't just intensively use those weapons for survival. Then there is the spread of composite bow in an important manner, and especially the kind of professionalization of the military. In late Roman times, as you know, the military was incredibly trained. The training could take decades in service for those who were called to be soldiers, as professionally for a lifetime. Given also that they were tied to the occupation of their parents in that regard by the Diocletian reforms. And then cavalry took over in general warfare. As far as missile troops developed in the Middle Ages, it was mostly crossbowmen that had a much greater they had weapons that had a much greater draw, by the way, because what's the also the force you can impress into a sling, right? It's mechanically speaking, that's important as well. And thus, there's also greater professionalization of warfare in feudal times, and so in general, the sling doesn't find too much space here and there. Again, there were slingers basically in every army, right? You can't think in ancient and medieval times, basically every army, even in late Middle Ages, there was surely some slinger, there's no doubt. Also, when you look at siege warfare, there were lots of stones around. There were probably not sling stones, but there were bigger ones that were used, even in very, advanced and refined, sophisticated type of siege warfare, still literally, to throw down the walls to smash, the enemy. That happened in every single time, right? It's one of the single most overlooked tactic that was employed in siege warfare all the time in massive amount. That is, I don't know, they were full of stones everywhere for that use. And however, javeliners, like the only time you find javeliners in medieval warfare consistently named, especially in the period that I specialize in, are basically siege warfare. You never find them mentioned in pitched battles. They're always in siege warfare, and they were also quite effective against armored troops, right? Striking at the joints of the armor at the time. And that's it. For the rest, crossbows were everywhere. They were predominant missile trooper, and that's pretty much it. So that's my take on it. And as for the rapid arrow fire, is both for ancient times and medieval times, it's bullshit. Yes, right, in warfare. Again, they would do it, but they would do it in a circus, right? And so that's also how, in parallel, people come up with that, analogically today when they think that we're, because the circus is kind of the level where those kind of ideas can come from. We'll respect for entertainers, but yeah, that's my thing. And so thank you for the comments. This is a user that I see he appears every once in a while. I'm pleased to see that there is some kind of fidelization of the audience. And yeah, I'm always glad to answer questions, because I think we all are here because we want to learn more. Like, starting from me, then I do this largely because I learn things myself every time. And so it's obvious that those who come to learn, who have spent time and energies to listen to my videos, they surely have all the questions in the world because they want to learn more. And yeah, I'm here for that. And so I'm glad if I can answer. So thank you a lot for the questions. For today, we stop it here. If you enjoyed this video, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.